The other settlers called it the stupidest thing they'd ever seen. While everyone else in Dakota Territory was raising their cabins on stone foundations to keep them off the cold ground, Heinrich Vogel was doing the opposite. He was digging down, 3 feet down into the frozen earth, excavating a massive pit where his cabin floor would sit below ground level. They watched him work through September 1873, shaking their heads, calling him a fool in English and German. They said he was building a root cellar, not a house. They said he'd flood out with the first spring melt. They said living in a hole in the ground was something animals did, not civilized men. By February 1874, Heinrich's partially buried cabin maintained an interior temperature of 68 degrees when the exterior temperature dropped to 32 below zero. His dirt floor, the feature everyone had mocked most viciously, was radiating stored geothermal heat upward into his living space. The 9 neighbors who froze to death that winter had all built their cabins the proper way, raised off the ground on stone piers, wooden floors suspended above the earth, built exactly the way every frontier guide and every experienced settler said to build them. Heinrich Vogel was 47 years old, a German immigrant who'd spent 20 years mining in the mountains of Saxony before coming to America. He understood earth and stone and heat in ways that farmers and trappers didn't. He'd worked in mines where temperatures stayed constant year-round regardless of surface weather. He'd felt warm air rising from deep shafts in winter and cool air flowing up in summer. He understood that the earth itself was a massive heat reservoir and that temperature stabilized the deeper you went below the surface. The knowledge that saved his life and the lives of everyone who sheltered in his cabin that winter wasn't frontier wisdom or American building tradition. It was mining knowledge, practical geology learned in European tunnels hundreds of feet underground, knowledge that seemed irrelevant to homesteading until winter came, and proved that sometimes the deepest wisdom comes from the deepest places. Heinrich Vogel arrived in Dakota Territory in May 1873 after working 3 years in Pennsylvania coal mines. He'd left Germany in 1870, part of the wave of immigrants seeking better opportunities after Prussian unification disrupted traditional economies. He'd been a mine foreman in Saxony, supervising crews extracting silver and copper from deep underground operations. The work was dangerous and the pay was poor, but it taught him things about earth, temperature, and stability that would prove invaluable on the frontier. When he filed his homestead claim near the settlement of Yankton, he had specific ideas about how to build his required cabin. Those ideas contradicted everything the American settlers around him considered standard practice. This created immediate friction. The typical homestead cabin in Dakota Territory in 1873 was built on a foundation that elevated it above ground level. Most commonly, settlers placed large flat stones at the corners and sometimes at the midpoints of walls, creating piers that raised the structure 6 to 12 inches off the earth. This served several purposes according to frontier wisdom. It prevented ground moisture from rotting the bottom logs. It kept the living space away from bugs and vermin that lived in the soil. It allowed air circulation beneath the floor, which supposedly kept things drier, and it prevented the cabin from drawing cold from the frozen ground in winter. Heinrich thought this was backwards. He'd spent 2 decades in mines where winter surface temperatures dropped well below zero, but shaft temperatures just a few feet underground remained constant at around 50 to 55 degrees year-round. The earth was a heat source in winter and a cooling source in summer. Why would you build a cabin that deliberately separated you from that temperature stability? His neighbors tried to explain it to him. The ground is cold, a settler named William Patterson told him in June. You build on the ground, your floor stays cold, everything stays cold. You raise the cabin up, you keep the cold out. The ground is not cold, Heinrich replied in his accented English. The surface is cold. Underground is warm. Underground ain't warm, it's dirt. Dirt is cold. In Saxony, in winter, when surface is -20, mine shaft 50 meters down is +12 Celsius. Always, earth holds heat. Patterson shook his head. Maybe in Germany. Here you build on the ground. You'll regret it come winter. Heinrich didn't argue further. He'd learned that Americans were confident in their methods and resistant to suggestions that contradicted their experience. But their experience was with surface construction. Heinrich had experience with underground environments, and he trusted that knowledge more than frontier conventional wisdom. Heinrich began his cabin construction in late June by doing something no other settler in the area had done. He started digging a large rectangular pit. The pit measured 16 feet by 20 feet. The dimensions of his planned cabin. He dug down 3 feet below the natural ground level, excavating approximately 300 cubic feet of earth. The work was brutal. Dakota soil in summer was hard-packed clay and rock. Heinrich worked with a pickaxe and shovel, breaking up the compacted earth and hauling it away in a wheelbarrow he'd purchased in Yankton. Other settlers watched with increasing bewilderment. "What are you building, Vogel? A grave?" one asked. "A house," Heinrich replied, continuing to dig. "Houses go up, not down. This house goes both." By mid-July, the pit was complete. Heinrich had excavated to a uniform depth of 3 feet across the entire footprint. He'd sloped the sides slightly to prevent collapse and had created a gentle ramp at what would be the side for easier entry and exit. The bottom of the pit he left as natural earth, but he compacted it thoroughly using a heavy wooden tamper he'd constructed. Then he began building walls, and this is where his method deviated even further from standard practice. Most settlers building log cabins notched their logs at corners and stacked them horizontally. Heinrich built his walls differently. His first course of logs sat directly on the natural earth at the bottom of his pit, resting on a layer of gravel he'd spread for drainage. But these logs weren't notched. Instead, he'd hewn them flat on both top and bottom surfaces, creating logs with 2 flat parallel sides. He laid these logs side by side around the perimeter of his pit, creating a foundation course that was 2 logs deep, 16 inches of solid timber, resting directly on the earth. Then he began stacking subsequent courses, but he did something unusual. He offset each course by half a log length, creating a running bond pattern similar to brickwork. This eliminated the weak points at corners that traditional notched construction created. The walls rose from the bottom of the pit. By the time they reached ground level, Heinrich had built 3 feet of log wall that was entirely underground. He continued building upward, and his walls eventually reached 7 feet above natural ground level. This meant his total wall height from pit floor to top was 10 feet, with 3 feet below ground and 7 feet above. His neighbors thought the below-ground portion was the most wasteful thing they'd ever seen. "You just buried 3 feet of good logs in a hole," Patterson said. "That's 3 feet of wall you'll never get any use from. Pure waste." "Those 3 feet are the most important," Heinrich replied. "They connect the cabin to earth heat. There is no earth heat. You've wasted lumber and weeks of work on nothing." Heinrich didn't argue. He simply continued building. The floor construction was what drew the most intense mockery. Every other cabin in the region had either a dirt floor at ground level or, more commonly among settlers with some resources, a raised wooden floor made from split logs or planks. Wooden floors were considered superior. They were cleaner, warmer underfoot, and more civilized than dirt. Heinrich's floor was dirt, but it wasn't simply packed earth at the bottom of his pit. He'd engineered it with specific layers designed to manage moisture and maximize heat transfer from the earth below. The bottom layer, at the floor of his 3-foot-deep pit, was 6 inches of coarse gravel. This layer provided drainage and prevented any groundwater from rising into the floor structure. On top of the gravel, Heinrich placed large flat stones, river rocks he'd hauled from a creek 2 miles away. These stones were 4 to 6 inches thick and as large as he could manage to move, some weighing over 100 pounds. He fit them together as tightly as possible, creating a layer of stone across the entire floor area. On top of the stones, he spread a layer of sand, filling the gaps between stones and creating a level surface. Then came the critical layer, 8 inches of clay-rich soil that Heinrich had specifically sourced from a deposit he'd found a mile from his claim. This wasn't random dirt. It was dense, heavy clay soil with minimal organic content. Heinrich compacted this clay layer using his wooden tamper, working section by section until the entire floor was compressed into a hard, dense surface. Then he mixed a slurry of clay and water and poured it over the compacted surface, allowing it to seep into any remaining air pockets. When it dried, he repeated the process. 3 applications of clay slurry created a floor surface that was nearly as hard as concrete, sealed against moisture infiltration, and dense enough to conduct heat efficiently. The final touch was a light coating of linseed oil that Heinrich applied to the dried clay surface. This wasn't for waterproofing. The clay itself was already dense enough to resist moisture. The oil was to harden the surface further and reduce dust. When finished, Heinrich's dirt floor was smooth, hard, and almost glossy. His neighbors were incredulous. "You spent 2 weeks building a dirt floor when you could have laid planks in 2 days, Patterson said. "I don't understand what you're thinking." "In winter, this floor will be warm," Heinrich explained. "Wood floor is cold. This floor draws heat from earth below. The earth below is frozen solid in winter. There's no heat to draw. 3 feet down, earth does not freeze, stays warm, always. That's nonsense. Ground freezes deep here. Everyone knows that. Heinrich had tried to explain the concept of frost depth and geothermal stability several times, but the settlers didn't want to hear it. They knew ground froze in winter. They'd seen it themselves. What they hadn't done was dig down and measure temperature at depth. Heinrich had. During his years in mines, he'd measured shaft temperatures at various depths. He'd seen the data. Frost penetrated 2 to 3 feet in severe winters, sometimes slightly more. Below that depth, temperature remained stable year-round, influenced more by geothermal heat flowing up from the Earth's deep interior than by surface weather conditions. A cabin floor 3 feet below the surface would sit right at the boundary between frozen surface layer and stable subsurface temperature. The stone and clay floor structure would conduct heat upward from the stable Earth below, radiating it into the living space above. In summer, the same system would work in reverse, conducting excess heat downward and keeping the cabin cool, but explaining geothermal principles to farmers who'd never thought about underground temperature gradients was frustrating. Heinrich eventually stopped trying. He'd prove his point when winter came, or he'd fail and learn he was wrong. Either way, argument was pointless. By late August, Heinrich's cabin was structurally complete. The walls rose 7 feet above ground level. He'd built a simple shed roof sloping from front to back, covered with split shingles and a layer of sod for insulation. He'd installed a door and one small window. Inside the cabin, the floor sat 3 feet below exterior ground level, creating a space that felt partially subterranean. The interior was unusual by frontier standards. When you entered through the door, you had to step down into the cabin. The door threshold was at ground level, but the floor was 3 feet lower. Heinrich had built 3 sturdy steps leading down from the door to the floor. This created an entrance that felt like descending into a basement, though the ceiling height was still adequate, about 7 feet from floor to ceiling beams. The partially buried design had another consequence. The window, though placed at what would normally be eye level, was actually well above the interior floor level. This meant the window admitted light, but was high enough that cold air drafts didn't flow across the living space. Heinrich built his fireplace in one corner, a small, efficient stone firebox with a chimney rising through the roof. But the fireplace was much smaller than what other settlers built. Most cabins had large fireplaces capable of burning substantial logs. Heinrich's firebox was modest, designed for smaller fires. His neighbors assumed this was a mistake born from inexperience. "You're going to freeze with that tiny fireplace," one settler predicted. "You need a big firebox to generate enough heat for winter." "I need only small fire," Heinrich said. "Floor provides heat. Fireplaces supplement." They laughed at that. A dirt floor providing heat? Ridiculous. Heinrich ignored them and continued his preparations, which included stockpiling a modest amount of firewood. Not the massive piles that other settlers were accumulating, but enough for his purposes. By September, the mockery had intensified. Visitors would stop by Heinrich's claim specifically to see the strange buried cabin with the dirt floor and tiny fireplace. Word had spread through the settlement. The German immigrant had built the most impractical cabin anyone had seen. He'd wasted weeks digging a pit, wasted lumber burying logs underground, and created a living space that resembled a cave more than a house. Vogel's hole became the local nickname. Some settlers were genuinely concerned for him. They thought he'd freeze to death in his inadequate cabin. Others were simply amused, figuring he'd learn his lesson and rebuild properly after a hard winter convinced him of his mistake. William Patterson organized a group of settlers to visit Heinrich in mid-September to make one final attempt at convincing him to modify his cabin. 5 men arrived at his claim one afternoon. "Heinrich, we need to talk seriously," Patterson said. "We're worried about you." "Worried? Your cabin isn't going to keep you alive through winter. You've built it all wrong." "How is wrong?" Patterson gestured at the structure. "It's half buried, which is going to make it cold and damp. Your floor is dirt, which is going to freeze solid and radiate cold upward. Your fireplace is too small to heat the space. You don't have enough firewood stockpiled. Everything about your setup is inadequate." Heinrich listened patiently. "I appreciate concern, but I believe cabin will work well. Belief doesn't keep you warm. Physics keeps you warm. Heat rises from fires. Cold comes from frozen ground. You've built a cabin that ignores these basic facts. In mines, we learned different physics," Heinrich said. "Earth is not enemy. Earth is friend. This isn't a mine. This is a cabin on the prairie. Different situation entirely." Temperature principles are same. Underground is stable, surface fluctuates. My cabin uses underground stability. The men exchanged glances. They'd tried. If Vogel wanted to freeze to death, that was his choice. They made one final offer. Heinrich could winter with one of them, abandoning his cabin until spring, when he could rebuild properly. Heinrich declined politely but firmly. He would stay in his cabin. He would prove his design worked, or he would die trying. The first freeze came on October 8th, 1873. Temperature dropped to 20 degrees overnight. Heinrich lit his first fire in his small fireplace, burning just a few pieces of wood. He wanted to establish a baseline for how his cabin performed. The results were immediate and remarkable. The cabin warmed quickly despite the small fire. Within an hour, the interior temperature reached 60 degrees. Heinrich let the fire burn out completely and monitored what happened. The temperature dropped, but slowly, very slowly. Over the next 12 hours, the interior temperature decreased by only 8 degrees. And here was the critical observation. The floor felt warm to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air temperature. Heat was flowing upward through the stone and clay layers, radiated from the stable earth below. Heinrich performed a more controlled test over the next week. He measured the temperature of his floor surface at multiple points, and at different times of day. The measurements were consistent. The floor maintained a temperature between 50 and 55 degrees regardless of exterior conditions. When exterior temperature was 30 degrees, the floor was 52 degrees. When exterior temperature rose to 50 degrees during the day, the floor temperature remained at 52 degrees. This was geothermal stability in action. The earth 3 feet below the surface was essentially disconnected from daily temperature fluctuations. It held a constant temperature determined by the annual average temperature of the region and by deep geothermal heat flow. That stable temperature was being conducted upward through Heinrich's carefully engineered floor structure, creating a heat source that required no fuel and never stopped working. Heinrich calculated the heat transfer. His floor area was approximately 320 square feet. If the floor was radiating heat at a rate that maintained its surface temperature 20 degrees above the interior air temperature during cold periods, that represented a continuous heat input of several thousand BTUs per hour. It was like having a very large, very low temperature heating element covering his entire floor. But the floor wasn't just radiating heat, it was also acting as thermal mass. During the day, when Heinrich burned his small fires, heat from the fire warmed the floor structure even further. The stone and clay layers absorbed that heat, stored it, and released it slowly over the following hours. The combination of geothermal heat and stored fire heat created a system that maintained stable interior temperatures with minimal fuel input. Heinrich tried to share these observations with his neighbors. He invited Patterson to visit and feel the floor for himself. Patterson was skeptical but curious enough to accept. "Put your hand on the floor," Heinrich said when Patterson arrived. Patterson knelt and placed his palm on the smooth clay surface. His expression changed. "It's warm." "Yes, always warm." "How?" "There's no fire right now. Heat comes from earth below, flows up through floor." Patterson stood, frowning. "That doesn't make sense. The ground is cold. Everyone knows that. Surface ground is cold. Deep ground is warm. This cabin connects to deep ground." "But we're not deep. We're only 3 feet down." 3 feet is enough. Below frost line, temperature is stable. 52, 53 degrees always. Floor conducts that heat upward." Patterson walked around the cabin, thinking. He was a practical man, not educated but intelligent. The warm floor was undeniable. He could feel it, but it contradicted everything he understood about cold weather and frozen ground. "Even if what you're saying is true," Patterson said finally, "a 50-degree floor doesn't heat a whole cabin. You still need fires. Small fires only. Floor provides base heat. Fire adds additional warmth as needed. We'll see come deep winter. When it's 30 below outside, your floor won't matter." "We will see," Heinrich agreed. November 1873 brought steadily dropping temperatures. By mid-month, nighttime lows were reaching 0. Snow fell frequently, accumulating to depths of 6 inches, then a foot. This was serious cold, and it was exposing weaknesses in cabin construction throughout the settlement. Heinrich's cabin continued performing exceptionally. Even without fires, the interior temperature never dropped below 50 degrees. When he burned his small evening fires, the temperature climbed to 65 or 68 degrees. His firewood consumption was minimal, perhaps 1/10 of what neighboring settlers were using. Other cabins were struggling. Standard construction with raised wooden floors meant there was an air gap between the floor and the frozen earth below. That air gap, which settlers believed provided insulation, was actually conducting cold upward. Cold air settled in the gap and chilled the wooden floor from beneath. Settlers were experiencing cold floors despite having fires burning. William Patterson stopped by Heinrich's cabin in late November, this time not to criticize but to understand. "I need to know how you're staying so warm," he admitted. "My cabin is burning through firewood like you wouldn't believe, and we're still cold. You're barely burning anything, and when I step inside here, it feels like spring." Heinrich explained again, more carefully this time. He walked Patterson through the principle of geothermal stability, explaining how mining experience had taught him about underground temperatures. He described how frost penetration was limited, how temperature stabilized below a certain depth, and how his floor structure was designed to conduct that stable earth temperature upward into the living space. "The earth is a heat source?" Patterson asked, still struggling with the concept. "In winter, yes. In summer, the earth is a cooling source. Always the earth is more moderate than the air. So by building partially underground, you're using the earth like a heat battery." "Exactly. Earth stores heat from summer, releases it in winter. But also, deep earth is always warm from the planet's core. Heat flows upward continuously, very slowly, but continuously. My floor taps into that flow." Patterson was silent for a long moment. "If this is true, then we've all been building wrong. We've been trying to separate our cabins from the ground, when we should have been connecting to it. For this climate, yes. In wet climate, building raised makes sense to avoid moisture. In this dry, cold climate, connection to Earth is better." "How do you know about the planet's core and heat flow?" "That's not common knowledge. In mines, we study geology. We must understand rock and heat and water to mine safely. I worked with engineers who explained these things. Heat increases as you go deeper underground. Everyone in mining knows this." Patterson left that day determined to modify his own cabin. But significant structural changes midwinter were difficult. He could add insulation, improve his chinking, burn more efficiently, but he couldn't change his foundation or floor without essentially rebuilding. December 1873 brought weather that tested every structure and every preparation. Temperature dropped to 20 below zero and stayed there for days. Then it dropped further. By December 18th, the temperature at Yankton was recorded at 32 below zero, the coldest temperature measured in Dakota Territory since record-keeping began. Heinrich's cabin maintained an interior temperature of 68 degrees. He burned slightly larger fires than in November, but his total firewood consumption was still remarkably low. The floor continued radiating steady heat. The partially buried walls, surrounded by earth on three sides, were insulated by the earth itself. Cold wind couldn't penetrate. Heat couldn't escape easily. The cabin was a stable thermal environment in the middle of killing cold. His neighbors were in crisis. Standard cabins couldn't maintain adequate temperatures. Settlers were burning enormous amounts of firewood and still struggling to keep interior temperatures above 30 degrees. Wooden floors were so cold that ice formed on their surfaces from condensation. Families huddled near fireplaces, unable to warm the rest of the cabin. The first death occurred on December 20th. A settler named John Matthews, whose claim was 3 miles from Heinrich's, froze to death in his cabin. He'd run out of firewood 2 days earlier and had been burning furniture. When that ran out, he'd had nothing left. His cabin, built with raised wooden floors and standard log walls, couldn't retain heat. The interior temperature dropped to near exterior temperature. Matthews apparently fell asleep and never woke up. Word spread quickly. Heinrich immediately opened his cabin to anyone who needed shelter. "My cabin is small, but warm," he told Patterson when they met in Yankton. "Anyone who is in danger, send them to me." Over the next week, Heinrich sheltered 7 people at various times. Some stayed a few hours to warm up before returning to their own cabins. Others stayed days. At peak occupancy, 5 people crowded into Heinrich's 16 by 20 cabin. It was cramped, but it was warm. The floor continued providing base heat. Small fires in the fireplace maintained comfortable temperatures. No one who sheltered in Heinrich's cabin suffered frostbite or serious cold injury, but 9 people in the surrounding area died. All 9 died in standard construction cabins with raised floors and inadequate heating. Some ran out of firewood. Others had firewood but couldn't generate enough heat to overcome the cold, radiating from their frozen floors and poorly insulated walls. The cabins that seemed properly built, that followed all the accepted rules of frontier construction, became death traps when extreme cold exceeded their thermal capabilities. Heinrich's cabin, the one everyone had mocked, was the only structure in the immediate area that maintained genuinely comfortable temperatures throughout the coldest period. The dirt floor that had been ridiculed as primitive was radiating life-saving heat. The partially buried design that had been called foolish was providing insulation and geothermal connection. The small fireplace that had been dismissed as inadequate was perfectly sized for a cabin that had a built-in heat source requiring no fuel. The extreme cold broke in early January. Temperature rose to a comparatively mild 10 below zero, which felt warm after weeks of far worse. Settlers began emerging from their cabins to assess damage and check on neighbors. The death toll became clear. 9 people dead in a 20-mile radius, all from cold-related causes. Dozens more had survived but suffered frostbite, respiratory damage from breathing frigid air, and trauma from the sustained exposure to life-threatening conditions. Heinrich's cabin became famous almost immediately. Survivors who'd sheltered there told everyone about the warm dirt floor, the stable, comfortable temperatures, the minimal fuel consumption. Settlers who visited were shocked by the contrast between Heinrich's interior environment and their own cabins. William Patterson organized a meeting at Heinrich's cabin in mid-January. 23 settlers crowded into and around the structure, with those who couldn't fit inside standing in the doorway or looking through the window. Patterson asked Heinrich to explain his construction method in detail. Heinrich walked them through every aspect: the 3-foot excavation that placed the floor below frost depth, the gravel drainage layer, the stone foundation layer that provided thermal mass and heat conduction pathways, the compacted clay floor that sealed against moisture while conducting heat efficiently, the partially buried walls that connected to earth temperature, the small efficient fireplace sized appropriately for a cabin with a built-in heat source. He explained the geothermal principle as clearly as he could. The earth several feet below the surface maintained stable temperature year-round. In Dakota Territory, that temperature was approximately 50 to 55 degrees. By positioning his floor at that depth and building it from materials that conducted heat well, he'd created a direct thermal connection to that stable temperature. His cabin couldn't get colder than the earth below it, which meant it couldn't get colder than about 50 degrees even if he burned no fires at all. The questions came rapidly. Could existing cabins be modified? How deep did you have to dig? What if you hit rock? What about moisture? What about spring flooding? Heinrich answered everything patiently, sharing his knowledge freely. Some modifications were possible for existing structures. A cabin built at ground level could be surrounded with earth berms pushed up against the walls, partially burying the lower portions and gaining some of the earth connection benefits. Floors could be improved by removing wooden planks, excavating down a foot or two, and installing a stone and clay floor structure. It wasn't as effective as building from scratch with a 3-foot excavation, but it was better than standard construction. Several settlers immediately began planning modifications. Others decided to rebuild entirely, following Heinrich's design. By spring of 1874, 7 new cabins were under construction in the Yankton area, all featuring partially buried designs with earth-connected floors. By 1876, the design had spread throughout Dakota Territory and into Minnesota. Settlers called them dugouts or earth-sheltered cabins, though Heinrich's specific design was more sophisticated than simple dugouts. The technical validation came from an unexpected source. A civil engineer named Robert Sullivan, working for the territorial government on railroad surveys, heard about Heinrich's cabin and visited in March 1874. Sullivan had formal training in thermodynamics and heat transfer. He measured temperatures at various points in Heinrich's cabin and in several standard cabins. He dug test holes to measure earth temperature at depth. Then he wrote a report for the territorial government documenting his findings. Sullivan's report confirmed everything Heinrich had claimed. The earth at 3 feet depth maintained a temperature of 52 degrees during winter, regardless of surface temperatures. Heinrich's floor structure conducted that heat upward efficiently. The cabin's heat loss was dramatically lower than standard construction due to the earth insulation surrounding the buried portions. The system was thermodynamically sound and remarkably efficient, according to Sullivan's technical assessment. The report was published in territorial newspapers and distributed to land offices. It validated Heinrich's methods with scientific authority and encouraged more settlers to adopt earth-sheltered designs. Sullivan's conclusion was particularly strong. Mr. Vogel's construction method represents a significant advancement in frontier architecture. His understanding of geothermal principles, though derived from mining experience rather than formal engineering education, is technically correct and practically superior to standard homestead construction in cold climates. Heinrich Vogel proved up his homestead claim in 1878, gaining full ownership of his 160 acres. He expanded his original cabin, adding a second room using the same earth-sheltered design. He married in 1880 a widow named Anna Schmidt, who had her own homestead claim nearby. They combined their lands and built a larger house, again using Heinrich's techniques of partial burial and earth-connected floors. The design principles Heinrich introduced became foundational knowledge in Northern Plains construction. By 1885, earth-sheltered designs were common throughout Dakota Territory, Montana, and the northern reaches of Nebraska and Wyoming. The specific implementation varied. Some builders dug deeper, others less deep. Some used stone floors, others clay. But the principle remained constant. Connect your living space to the stable earth temperature below frost depth. Modern geothermal heating systems use the same principle Heinrich understood in 1873. Ground source heat pumps extract heat from the earth at depths of 6 to 10 feet, where temperature remains stable year-round. The technology is sophisticated, using refrigerants and compressors to move heat efficiently. But the fundamental concept that the Earth is a stable heat source in winter and heat sink in summer is identical to what Heinrich applied in his cabin floor design. The physics of Heinrich's success can be quantified. A square foot of earth at 52 degrees surrounded by air at 30 degrees will transfer heat at a rate determined by the temperature difference and the thermal conductivity of materials between them. Heinrich's stone and clay floor structure had good thermal conductivity. His 320 square foot floor, radiating heat continuously, provided approximately 3,000 to 4,000 BTUs per hour of heating when exterior temperatures were extremely cold. This doesn't sound like much compared to a roaring fireplace producing 30,000 BTUs per hour, but it's continuous, requires no fuel, and never fails. Over a 24-hour period, Heinrich's floor provided 72,000 to 96,000 BTUs of heating energy without burning a single piece of wood. That base heat load meant his fireplace only needed to make up the difference between the floor's contribution and his total heating needs. In extreme cold, he might need to add another 4,000 to 6,000 BTUs per hour from fires. In moderate cold, the floor alone was almost sufficient. Standard cabins had no base heat source. Every BTU had to come from burning wood. When exterior temperature was 32 below zero, a standard cabin might need 8,000 to 10,000 BTUs per hour just to maintain 30 degrees interior temperature. To reach 68 degrees like Heinrich achieved, they'd need 15,000 to 20,000 BTUs per hour. Sustaining that rate of burning over days or weeks consumed firewood at rates that few settlers could maintain. Heinrich's firewood consumption was approximately 1/8 that of standard cabins for the same interior comfort level. This efficiency wasn't luck or magic. It was applied thermodynamics, mining knowledge transferred to homestead construction, and understanding that the earth itself was a resource for temperature management. The moisture management aspect of Heinrich's design proved equally important in the long term. Standard cabins with crawl spaces beneath raised floors often experienced moisture problems. Water vapor from the ground condensed on the cold undersides of wooden floors, causing rot. Heinrich's sealed clay floor prevented moisture migration from below, while the earth itself wickered moisture away from the floor structure. By 1900, Heinrich's original cabin had been occupied continuously for 27 years. The floor showed no deterioration. The partially buried walls remained sound. The structure required minimal maintenance compared to standard construction. When Heinrich finally built his larger house and stopped using the original cabin for living purposes, he converted it to storage. It remained standing and functional until 1957, when it was finally demolished to make way for modern construction. Portions of the stone floor were preserved and are now displayed at the Dakota Territorial Museum in Yankton. The human cost of ignorance was stark. 9 people died in December 1873 within 20 miles of Heinrich's cabin. Every death occurred in standard construction cabins that followed accepted building practices. Not one person sheltering in Heinrich's earth-sheltered cabin died or suffered serious cold injury. The difference was literally life versus death, and the difference came down to understanding geothermal principles versus following conventional wisdom. The settlers who survived learned hard lessons. They learned that knowledge from unexpected sources, mining in Heinrich's case, could be more valuable than frontier traditions. tradition. They learned that methods that seemed primitive or backwards might be technically superior. They learned that mockery was often just ignorance dressed up as confidence. William Patterson, who'd been among Heinrich's harshest critics, became one of his strongest advocates. Patterson modified his own cabin with earth berms and an improved floor, then helped other settlers implement similar changes. He lived until 1903 and told the story of Heinrich's cabin to anyone who would listen. "We called him a fool for building a hole in the ground," Patterson would say. "Turns out he was the only wise man among us. We were building up in the air, separating ourselves from the one free heat source available to us. Heinrich was building down, connecting to the earth. He understood something we didn't, and that understanding saved lives." Heinrich Vogel died in 1919 at age 93, having lived far longer than most of his contemporary settlers. He'd become prosperous through farming and land speculation, owning over 800 acres by the time of his death. His obituary in the Yankton newspaper devoted 3 paragraphs to his innovative cabin design and credited him with introducing earth-sheltered construction to Dakota Territory. The lesson from Heinrich's dirt floor extends beyond construction techniques. It speaks to the value of transferable knowledge, of understanding fundamental principles rather than simply following established practices. Heinrich's mining experience gave him insights into earth temperature that frontier farmers lacked. When he applied those insights to homestead construction, he created something that seemed wrong by all conventional standards, but proved superior by every measurable outcome. The dirt floor that everyone mocked kept his cabin at 68 degrees, while 9 neighbors froze to death in cabins with proper raised wooden floors. That wasn't accident or luck. It was science, practical geology, and the courage to build according to understanding rather than convention. The earth beneath Heinrich's cabin was radiating heat upward continuously, a free, inexhaustible heat source that required only proper engineering to access. Everyone mocked his dirt floor until winter proved it was the smartest thing any settler in Dakota Territory had built. The cabin that looked like a primitive hole in the ground was actually the most technically advanced structure in the region, and the immigrant they'd called a fool was the only one who truly understood how to survive in a place where extreme cold killed without mercy. The floor stayed warm, the cabin stayed at 68 degrees, and Heinrich Vogel lived to see his backwards methods become standard practice across the northern plains. Sometimes the stupidest thing you've ever seen is just the thing you don't understand yet.